I watched from my cabin window as the construction crew started clearing brush along the ridge that separated my property from the Whispering Pines HOA development, thinking they were just doing some routine maintenance on their side of the line. That was my first mistake, assuming they knew where that line actually was. My name is Lucas Zimmerman, and I had owned this 140-acre parcel in the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina for going on 15 years. The property had been in my family since the 1960s, passed down from my grandfather who bought it for practically nothing back when land out here was cheap and nobody cared about mountain views. The HOA development, Whispering Pines, had sprung up about 7 years ago on the adjacent property, transforming what used to be old-growth forest into a maze of cookie-cutter houses and perfectly manicured lawns that looked ridiculous this far up in the mountains. I had never joined their HOA, obviously. My property predated theirs by decades, and I had my own private drive that connected to County Road 47 about 2 miles down the mountain. But that had never stopped them from trying to involve me in their nonsense. Every few months, I would get a letter from their board, usually signed by someone named Patricia Hendricks, the HOA president, asking me to contribute to road maintenance or snow removal for roads I did not even use. I always tossed those letters straight into the fireplace. The construction started in early March, just as the last of the winter snow was melting. I noticed the heavy equipment first, a couple of excavators and a bulldozer making their way up what I had always considered my ridge. The ridge ran roughly north to south along the eastern edge of my property, a rocky spine that offered incredible views of the valley below. I had always planned to build a few guest cabins up there eventually, but life and a comfortable income from my software consulting business meant I had never gotten around to it. I drove my truck up the old logging road that wound toward the ridge, curious about what they were doing. When I crested the hill, I saw about a dozen workers laying out building foundations. There were wooden stakes everywhere, bright orange surveyor tape fluttering in the wind, and someone in a hard hat shouting directions while looking at a set of blueprints. "Hey," I called out, walking over to the man with the blueprints. "What is going on here?" He looked up, clearly annoyed at the interruption. "Construction project for the HOA. We are putting in vacation cabins." "Who are you?" "Lucas Zimmerman. I own the property adjacent to Whispering Pines." "Okay, well, this is HOA property, so unless you have business here, you need to clear out. This is a hard hat area." I felt my jaw tighten. "This ridge is on my property line. Are you sure you are not over the boundary?" The man, whose name tag read Gerald, sighed heavily and unfolded a different sheet from his clipboard. "Look, we had this surveyed last month. This whole ridge area is part of the Whispering Pines development. See?" He jabbed his finger at a map that meant nothing to me without reference points. "I would like to see the actual survey stakes," I said. "They are all marked. Orange tape. Now, if you do not mind, we have work to do." I walked around the site, following the orange tape, and something felt wrong. The markers seemed to cut well into what I knew was my property, but without my own survey equipment, I could not be certain. The ridge had always been the natural boundary, sitting roughly equidistant between my main cabin and the nearest HOA houses, but boundaries and natural features do not always align. Over the next few weeks, I watched the construction progress rapidly. These were not simple cabins either. Each structure was going to be a fully equipped luxury vacation rental, complete with heated floors, full kitchens, and large decks overlooking the valley. I counted the foundation pours. 22 cabins, arranged in a curved line along the ridge, each positioned to maximize the view. I kept meaning to dig out my grandfather's old survey documents, but work got busy. I had 3 major clients launching new products, which meant 18-hour days of coding and troubleshooting. By the time I came up for air in mid-April, the cabin frames were already up, and I could see workers running electrical conduit between the structures. That was when Patricia Hendricks showed up at my door. She was exactly what you would expect from an HOA president. A woman in her early 50s with an aggressive blonde bob haircut and the kind of smile that never reached her eyes. She wore expensive athletic wear despite clearly never having done athletics in her life, and she carried a leather portfolio that probably cost more than my truck payment. "Mr. Zimmerman," she said when I opened the door. "I am Patricia Hendricks, president of the Whispering Pines HOA board. Do you have a moment? What can I do for you, Patricia? May I come in? This is rather important." I considered telling her no, but curiosity won out. I led her to my living room, which was rustic in the way that old mountain cabins are, with exposed log walls and a stone fireplace that dominated one side of the room. Patricia looked around with barely concealed distaste before perching on the edge of my couch like she was afraid it might be dirty. "Mr. Zimmerman, I wanted to inform you about an exciting development for our community. We have invested significantly in a new vacation rental project on the ridge, 22 luxury cabins that will bring substantial tourism revenue to the area." "I have seen the construction," I said. "Excellent. Now, the reason I am here is that we will be running a main electrical line and water supply up to the ridge, and the most efficient route would cut across the corner of your property. Just a small easement, really, maybe 50 feet wide at most. We are prepared to compensate you, of course. Say $5,000. I leaned back in my chair. "You want to run utilities across my land to service cabins that you built on what might be my land." Her smile tightened. "The cabins are definitely on HOA property, Mr. Zimmerman. We had a professional survey done. But yes, the utility easement would benefit both of us. You would get access to our upgraded electrical service, which I am sure would be an improvement over whatever you currently have. My electricity works fine." $5,000 is quite generous for such a small easement, she pressed. "I will think about it," I said, standing up to signal the conversation was over. Patricia's expression hardened. "Mr. Zimmerman, we are going to run those utilities one way or another. We have legal options if you refuse to cooperate. I am offering you a chance to be compensated." And I said I will think about it. "Have a good day, Patricia." She left in a huff, her SUV spitting gravel as she drove away down my driveway. After she was gone, I finally did what I should have done weeks ago. I went to the old filing cabinet in my office and started pulling out property documents. My grandfather had been meticulous about paperwork. I found the original deed, property surveys from 1964, 1978, and 1996, tax records, and a hand-drawn map he had made himself showing all the boundary markers. According to his notes, there were iron pins driven into the ground at each corner of the property, and the eastern boundary ran along the ridge, but not on top of it. The boundary was actually about 200 feet east of the ridgeline, which meant the ridge itself was entirely on my property. I spread the 1996 survey out on my desk. It was the most recent professional survey, done when my father had inherited the property. The map clearly showed the ridge within our property boundaries, with detailed measurements to each corner marker. If this survey was accurate, the HOA had not just built on my property. They had built deep into it, probably a good 150 feet over the line. The next morning, I called the surveyor whose name was on the 1996 document, hoping the company was still in business. I got lucky. Morrison and Associates Land Surveying was not only still around, but Thomas Morrison himself, now in his 70s, still consulted for the firm. "The Zimmerman property," he said when I explained why I was calling. "Of course I remember it. Beautiful piece of land. What is the problem?" I explained about the HOA construction, and he went quiet for a long moment. "You are telling me they built 22 structures on what they think is their property, but you believe is actually on yours. That is what my paperwork suggests." "Mr. Zimmerman, I would be happy to come out and verify the old survey markers. If they are still in place, we can determine the exact boundary. But I have to warn you, if those cabins are on your property, this is going to get very ugly very fast. How soon can you come out?" "I can be there tomorrow." Thomas Morrison arrived at 9 in the morning with his assistant, a younger woman named Jennifer, who carried what looked like a high-tech surveying rig. They spent the entire day walking my property line, using metal detectors to find the old iron pins and GPS equipment to mark exact locations. I followed them for most of it, watching as they worked with careful precision. By late afternoon, they had traced the entire eastern boundary. Thomas asked me to meet him back at my cabin, and when I got there, his expression told me everything I needed to know before he said a word. "Lucas," he said, and the use of my first name felt ominous. "The old markers are all exactly where we placed them in 1996. I have verified the boundary with GPS coordinates and cross-referenced with the county records. The HOA cabins are not just on your property. All 22 of them are entirely on your land. The nearest one is about 90 feet from the actual property line." I sat down heavily on my porch steps. "You are absolutely certain?" "I will stake my professional reputation on it. They are on your property, no question." "How does something like this happen?" Jennifer spoke up. "We hiked over to look at their survey stakes while you were walking the north boundary with Thomas. Their markers are placed along a fence line that runs on top of the ridge. But that fence is not on the property boundary. Looking at the county records, that fence was put up sometime in the early 2000s by the previous owner of what is now the HOA development. It was never a legal boundary marker, just a fence. My guess is their surveyor used the fence as a reference point without actually verifying the original property markers." Thomas nodded. "It is lazy surveying, plain and simple. Any competent surveyor should have located the iron pins and worked from those. Instead, they assumed the fence marked the boundary." "What do I do now?" I asked. "Document everything," Thomas said. "I am going to write up a formal survey report with all our findings. You should also report this to the county building department, because I guarantee the HOA got building permits based on their faulty survey. Those permits are invalid if the structures are not on their property." "This is going to be a nightmare," I said. "Yes," Thomas agreed. "But it is their nightmare, not yours. They are the ones who built on land they do not own." After Thomas and Jennifer left, I sat on my porch and looked toward the ridge. I could see the cabins from here, their raw wood framing golden in the late afternoon sun. Someone had invested serious money in this project. The cabins themselves probably ran at least $200,000 each, and that was before furnishings and landscaping. We were talking about a multi-million-dollar development, all sitting on my property. I could have called Patricia Hendricks right then. Could have marched over there and demanded they stop construction immediately, but something made me pause. These people had been dismissive and arrogant, had tried to strong-arm me into giving them an easement for utilities to service structures they had illegally built on my land. Patricia had even threatened me with legal action. So I made a decision that some might call petty, but which I considered poetic justice. I was going to let them finish. Over the next 8 weeks, I watched the construction with new interest. They brought in plumbing crews and ran water lines from the HOA's main supply. They trenched in electrical lines, installed transformers, and wired every single cabin with full electrical service. They added propane tanks for backup heating, installed septic systems for each cabin, and brought in landscapers to plant native gardens around each structure. The interiors were finished with high-end fixtures. I took a walk through the site one evening after the workers had left and peered through windows. Granite countertops, stainless steel appliances, custom tile work in the bathrooms, and heated floors throughout. Each cabin had a stone fireplace and a spacious deck with cable railings to preserve the view. They even installed a central management office at the south end of the development, a slightly larger structure that would serve as a check-in point for renters and a maintenance hub. The sign out front read Ridge View Luxury Cabins, opening June 1st. I photographed everything. Every stage of construction, every utility installation, every finishing touch. I documented it all meticulously, creating a detailed timeline with dates and descriptions. Thomas Morrison stopped by twice more to update his survey report and add notes about the completed structures. "You know they are about to start taking reservations," he said during his second visit in late May. "I saw advertisements online. They are charging premium rates too, between $300 and $500 per night depending on the cabin size." "I know," I said. "I have been watching their website." Thomas gave me a long look. "You are waiting for something." "I am waiting for them to be fully invested," I said. "When they have completed everything, when they have spent every dollar, when they think they are about to start seeing returns on their investment, that is when I am going to show them the survey." "That is cold, Lucas. They built on my land without permission. They tried to bully me." "They deserve what is coming." The confrontation came on May 28th, 3 days before the official opening. The HOA held a ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Ridge View cabins, complete with a local photographer, representatives from the County Tourism Board, and champagne for the board members. I watched from a distance as Patricia Hendricks gave a speech about vision and community investment, and how this project would put Whispering Pines on the map as a premier mountain vacation destination. When the ceremony ended and the crowd dispersed, I walked over to where Patricia stood with 3 other board members, all of them admiring their handiwork. "Quite a project you have built here," I said. Patricia turned, and her expression soured immediately upon seeing me. "Mr. Zimmerman, I assume you are here to reconsider our easement offer, though I am afraid the price has gone down considerably given your lack of cooperation. We found another route for the utilities." "I can see that," I said. "Very thorough installation, must have cost quite a bit." "The HOA invested $4.7 million into this development," said one of the men, who I later learned was David Kramer, the HOA treasurer. "It is going to transform our community's financial outlook." "About that," I said, pulling folded papers from my jacket pocket. "I think you should see these." I handed Patricia the survey report from Morrison and Associates. She unfolded it, frowning as she tried to make sense of the technical drawings. "What is this?" she asked. "That is a certified property survey showing the actual boundary between my property and the Whispering Pines development. You will notice that the boundary is not where you think it is." David grabbed the papers and studied them more carefully. His face went pale. "This shows the boundary 200 feet east of the ridge." "That is correct," I said, "which means every single one of your cabins is built entirely on my property. You are trespassing." "That is ridiculous," Patricia snapped. "We had a survey done, we have documentation." "You had a survey done by someone who did not bother to locate the actual property markers. Thomas Morrison, who did my survey, has been working these mountains for 50 years. His work is gold standard. If you want to contest it, you are welcome to get your own certified survey, but I promise you it will show the same thing. Another board member, a woman named Susan, spoke up. There must be some mistake. We filed all the proper permits with the county. Permits that were issued based on your faulty survey, I said. I have already been in contact with the county building department. They are very interested in how this happened. Patricia's face had gone from pale to red. You are trying to shake us down. How much do you want? Excuse me. How much money do you want to make this go away? To sign over enough property to legitimize the cabins. I smiled, and it was not a friendly smile. Patricia, you cannot afford me. This is premium mountain property with incredible views. You know what this land is worth. Even if I wanted to sell, which I do not, you would be looking at multiple millions just for the acreage, never mind what you have already built. We will sue you, she threatened. For what? Owning my own property. Please do. I would love to watch you try to explain to a judge why you think you have the right to build a multi-million-dollar development on someone else's land without permission. David was frantically scrolling through his phone. We need to call our lawyer. Right now. Good idea, I said. You are going to need a very good lawyer. While you are at it, you might want to contact your insurance company and probably start figuring out how you are going to explain this to everyone who already has reservations for June. I left them standing there in a tight, panicked huddle and walked back to my cabin. My hands were shaking slightly from the adrenaline, but I felt oddly calm. I had been preparing for this moment for months, and it had gone exactly as I expected. The next day, I received a certified letter from a law firm in Asheville representing the Whispering Pines HOA. It was full of legal language, but the gist was that they were demanding I withdraw my claim and threatening legal action for what they called fraudulent interference with business operations. I forwarded the letter to my own attorney, Margaret Winters, who I had retained the previous month in preparation for exactly this scenario. Margaret was a property law specialist in her 60s with a reputation for being absolutely ruthless when she needed to be. She called me that afternoon, laughing. Lucas, this letter is one of the most absurd things I have read in my 30-year career. They are threatening to sue you for interfering with their business when they built that business on your land without permission. What are these people thinking? I think they are panicking, I said, with good reason. I am going to send them a response today. You want to know what your options are here? Tell me. First, you can demand immediate removal of all structures. You would be within your rights to require them to tear down every cabin at their own expense and restore the land to its original condition. Second, you could negotiate a sale of the property the cabins sit on, though you would set the price. Third, you could negotiate a lease arrangement where they pay you rent for the land usage. Or fourth, and this is the nuclear option, you could file for adverse possession in reverse, essentially claiming ownership of the structures they built on your property and evicting them from any involvement. Can I really do that last one? The structures are on your property. They built them without your permission. In North Carolina, improvements made on someone else's land generally become the property of the landowner. You would need to compensate them for the value of the structures, but you could probably argue that value is severely diminished by the fact that they are trespassing improvements. It would be complicated and messy, but yes, it is an option. I thought about it. For now, let us go with demanding removal and see how they respond. I want them to fully understand the gravity of what they have done. Margaret drafted a response that was delivered the following day. In it, she laid out the facts. The cabins were on my property. The HOA had no legal right to them, and I was demanding immediate cessation of all business operations and removal of all structures within 90 days. The response from the HOA's lawyer came within hours. They were requesting a meeting to discuss a reasonable resolution. We met at a neutral location, a conference room in an Asheville law office. On their side of the table sat Patricia, David, Susan, and two other board members I did not know, along with their attorney, a nervous-looking man named Robert Chen. On my side sat Margaret and myself. "Let us be clear about where we stand," Margaret began before anyone else could speak. "My client owns the property your cabins are built on. Your survey was incorrect, and you proceeded with construction without verifying the actual property boundaries. Every structure you built is trespassing, and my client has every legal right to demand their removal." Robert cleared his throat. "My clients acknowledge there may have been a surveying error, but they acted in good faith based on professional advice. Demanding removal of $4.7 million in improvements seems excessive when we can reach an accommodation." "Your client's good faith is irrelevant," Margaret said. "They built on land they do not own. What kind of accommodation did you have in mind?" Patricia leaned forward. "We are prepared to offer Mr. Zimmerman $200,000 for the property the cabins occupy." I actually laughed out loud. $200,000 for 30 acres of prime ridge view property plus retroactive permission to build a commercial development. You cannot be serious. "That is more than fair market value for raw land in this area," Patricia insisted. Margaret slid a folder across the table. "This is an appraisal I commissioned last week. Comparable properties in this area with similar views are selling for between $20,000 and $30,000 per acre. So we are looking at minimum $600,000 just for the land value. But Mr. Zimmerman's property is not comparable properties. It is better positioned, has superior views, and now has improved access thanks to your construction roads. I would put the value closer to $40,000 an acre, which is $1.2 million. "That is highway robbery," David sputtered. "No," I said quietly. "Highway robbery is building a multi-million-dollar commercial development on someone else's property without asking permission, and then offering them a tiny fraction of what it is worth when you get caught." Susan, who had been quiet until now, spoke up. "What if we offered a lease arrangement? We pay you monthly rent for the land use." "What kind of rent?" I asked. "We were thinking $3,000 per month," she said. Margaret actually laughed. "You expect to run a vacation rental operation that will gross approximately $150,000 per month in peak season, and you want to pay the landowner $3,000. That is 2%. Standard commercial land leases in this area run between 10 and 20% of gross revenue." The number seemed to stun them. Robert whispered urgently with his clients for several minutes. Finally, Patricia spoke, and her voice was strained. "We need time to consider our options and secure financing. Can we have 60 days? "No," I said. "You can have 30 days to make a serious offer either for purchase or lease. If I do not have an acceptable offer by then, I am filing for removal of the structures and pursuing damages for unauthorized commercial use of my property." We left them sitting in that conference room, and I could see the panic setting in. The grand opening was supposed to happen in 3 days. They had reservations booked through September. They had advertised across multiple states and travel websites. And now their entire project was revealed to be built on land they did not own, without permission from the actual owner. The next day, June 1st, I watched from my cabin as chaos unfolded at the Ridge View cabins. The planned grand opening was canceled. Guests who arrived for their reservations were turned away. I could see Patricia and other board members having heated conversations in the parking area of the management office. My phone rang constantly with calls from the HOA, which I ignored. Finally, on June 3rd, Margaret called with news. "They are in full panic mode," she said. "Their attorney called me this morning. They want to know if you would consider a lease to purchase agreement. They would pay you monthly rent with the option to buy the property after 2 years at a set price." "What are the terms?" 15% of gross revenue with a $3,000 monthly minimum and a purchase price of $1.5 million at the end of 2 years. I did the math. If the cabins performed as projected, 15% of gross revenue would be around $20,000 per month in peak season, maybe $12,000 in slow months. Over 2 years, I would collect somewhere between $300,000 and $400,000 in lease payments, plus $1.5 million at the end. Total value around $2 million, paid over time. Counter with 20% of gross revenue, $5,000 monthly minimum, and $2 million purchase price, I said. And I want complete financial transparency, monthly statements showing all revenue and expenses. Margaret negotiated back and forth over the next week. The final agreed terms were 18% of gross revenue, $4,000 minimum monthly, and $1.8 million purchase price after 2 years. I also got quarterly auditing rights and a clause that if they missed any payment by more than 30 days, the entire operation reverted to me immediately with no refund of previous payments. We signed the agreement on June 10th. The HOA had to scramble to reschedule their opening, which finally happened on June 15th with much less fanfare than originally planned. I received my first lease payment of $4,000 on July 1st, and a statement showing that, despite the delayed opening, they had still managed to book 14 of the 22 cabins for significant portions of June. My 18% cut was $6,200. The money was nice, but what I really enjoyed was the shift in how the HOA treated me. Patricia no longer sent demanding letters. When she saw me in town, she was coldly polite but nothing more. The HOA board had learned an expensive lesson about property rights and the importance of proper due diligence. Things went smoothly through the summer. The cabins performed even better than projected, and my monthly payments ranged from $15,000 to $23,000. I invested most of it, knowing that the real payday would come in 2 years when they either purchased the property or defaulted, and I took over the entire operation. Then, in late August, things got interesting again. I was in town buying supplies when I ran into Thomas Morrison at the hardware store. He pulled me aside with a concerned expression. "Lucas, I need to tell you something and you are not going to like it. What is going on?" I was having lunch at the diner yesterday, and I overheard Patricia Hendricks talking with someone I did not recognize. They were discussing something about selling the HOA's common property to finance getting out from under your lease agreement. "They cannot sell common property without a vote of the HOA members," I said. "I know, but she was talking about calling an emergency meeting and pushing it through quickly. Something about not letting the members know the real reason for the sale. This worried me. If the HOA was planning to manipulate its members into selling off assets to raise money, it suggested they had no intention of honoring the full lease to purchase agreement. They were going to try to accumulate enough capital to buy my property early, probably at a fraction of the agreed price, or they were going to default deliberately and try to tie me up in legal battles. I called Margaret immediately and explained what I had heard. "If they default, the agreement is clear," she said. "But if they are planning to manipulate HOA members through fraud, that is a different matter. That could be criminal. Let me do some digging." 2 days later, Margaret called back. I have a contact at the county clerk's office who flagged something interesting. The Whispering Pines HOA has filed notice of a special meeting scheduled for September 15th. The agenda item is listed as sale of undeveloped common land to fund community improvements. But here is the thing. I looked at the HOA's original development plan, that undeveloped common land they want to sell. It includes a 20-acre parcel that was designated as protected green space in perpetuity as part of their original zoning approval. Can they even sell that legally? I asked. Not without going back to the county for zoning approval, which they have not done. If they sell it without approval, they are violating their development agreement with the county. But more importantly, if they are not telling the HOA members the real reason for the sale, which is to get out from under a lease agreement that exists because of the board's own negligence, that is fraud. What do? Go to that meeting. As a leaseholder with a financial interest in the HOA's operations, you have a right to attend. I will come with you. The HOA special meeting was held in the community center at Whispering Pines, a building designed to look like a rustic lodge but which felt more like a suburban McMansion. When Margaret and I arrived at 7 p.m. on September 15th, the parking lot was already full. Apparently, word had gotten out that something significant was happening, and homeowners were curious. Patricia stood at the front of the room with the other board members, looking distinctly uncomfortable when she saw me walk in. I took a seat in the back row with Margaret beside me. Patricia called the meeting to order and launched into a prepared speech about community growth and opportunities. Tonight, we are asking for approval to sell a 20-acre parcel of undeveloped common land to a developer who has offered $1.6 million. This money would be used to upgrade our community amenities, including a new pool complex and renovations to this community center. Hands shot up around the room. A man in the front row stood without being called on. Why are we selling protected green space? I thought that land was supposed to stay undeveloped forever. The designation can be modified, Patricia said smoothly. The buyer is planning a low-impact development that would be in keeping with our community values. Who is the buyer? Someone else called out. That is confidential during negotiations, David interjected. I stood up. I would like to ask a question. The room went quiet, and Patricia's expression hardened. Mr. Zimmerman, you are not a member of this HOA. I am not sure you have standing to speak here. Margaret stood beside me. Mr. Zimmerman holds a significant lease agreement with the HOA regarding the Ridge View Cabins development. As someone with direct financial ties to the HOA's operations, he absolutely has standing. Unless you would like me to get a court order to that effect, Patricia's jaw tightened. What is your question, Mr. Zimmerman? Is this sale related to the Ridge View Cabins situation? I do not see how that is relevant, Patricia said. I think it is very relevant, I said loudly enough for everyone to hear. How many people in this room know that the Ridge View Cabins are built on my property, not HOA property? There was immediate murmuring throughout the room. Clearly, most of the residents had no idea. That is a gross oversimplification, Patricia started, but I cut her off. It is a simple fact. Your board commissioned a faulty survey and built a $4.7 million development entirely on my property without permission. When I discovered this and provided proof, instead of admitting the mistake, they tried to lowball me on a purchase price. We eventually settled on a lease-to-purchase agreement, but it is expensive because the board's negligence was expensive. Now they want to sell off your protected green space to raise money, likely to buy out that lease early, but they are not telling you the real reason. The room erupted. People were shouting questions, and several residents were on their feet demanding answers from the board. Patricia tried to regain control. "This is completely inappropriate. Mr. Zimmerman is disrupting official HOA business." An older woman near the front stood up. "I am Barbara Lewis, and I have been a resident here since Whispering Pines opened." "Patricia, is what Mr. Zimmerman said true?" "Did you build those cabins on his property?" David tried to answer. "There was a surveying discrepancy that we have resolved through a legal agreement." "A discrepancy," I said. "You built 22 cabins completely on my land. That is not a discrepancy, that is gross negligence." Margaret pulled out copies of the survey report and the lease agreement. "I have documentation here that anyone is welcome to review. The facts are clear. The board's error is costing the HOA approximately $15,000 to $20,000 per month in lease payments, plus a required purchase price of $1.8 million in less than 2 years. $2 million, someone shouted. "Where is that money supposed to come from?" The meeting devolved into chaos. Residents were demanding to see the financial records, demanding the board's resignation, and generally making it clear they had no intention of approving any sale of common property under these circumstances. Patricia tried to adjourn the meeting, but by then it was too late. The residents voted right there, without any formality, to reject the proposed sale and to call for a full independent audit of HOA finances and the Ridge View cabin situation. As Margaret and I left, residents stopped me to shake my hand and thank me for exposing what was happening. Several people apologized for how the board had treated me. One man, who introduced himself as Richard Powell, asked if I would be willing to meet with some concerned residents who were planning to recall the entire board. Over the next 2 weeks, the Whispering Pines HOA imploded. An independent auditor was brought in and discovered that Patricia and David had been paying themselves consulting fees from HOA funds without proper authorization. They had also structured the Ridge View Cabins project through a separate LLC they controlled, meaning they were personally profiting from rentals while the HOA bore all the risk and costs of my lease agreement. The more the auditor dug, the worse it got. There was missing money, unauthorized expenditures, and a pattern of self-dealing that went back years. The total amount of misappropriated funds was estimated at over $300,000. On October 3rd, I got a call from Detective Sarah Kim with the Henderson County Sheriff's Office. "Mr. Zimmerman, I am investigating allegations of fraud and embezzlement related to the Whispering Pines HOA. I understand you have a lease agreement with them regarding a property development. Would you be willing to provide documentation and answer some questions?" "Absolutely," I said. I met with Detective Kim the next day and provided everything I had: survey documents, correspondence, the lease agreement, payment records, and all the notes I had taken during the construction process. She was particularly interested in the timeline and how the board had tried to pressure me early on. "Did they ever explicitly threaten you?" she asked. Patricia said they would find legal ways to run utilities across my property whether I agreed or not. At the time, I did not think much of it, but looking back, it felt like a threat. Detective Kim nodded, making notes. "We are building a case against Patricia Hendricks and David Kramer for felony embezzlement and fraud. The other board members appear to have been negligent but not criminally involved. Your documentation helps establish a pattern of behavior." "What happens to the Ridge View cabins?" I asked. "That is a civil matter between you and the HOA. But I imagine with the current board facing criminal charges, you will be dealing with new leadership soon." She was right. Within a week, Patricia, David, and Susan all resigned from the board under pressure. An interim board was elected, led by Richard Powell and two other longtime residents who seemed determined to clean up the mess. Richard called me on October 12th. "Mr. Zimmerman, I want to apologize on behalf of Whispering Pines for how you have been treated. The previous board acted unethically and possibly criminally. We are committed to honoring our agreement with you, but I wanted to ask if you would be willing to discuss modified terms." "What did you have in mind?" I asked cautiously. "Honestly, the HOA cannot afford the lease to purchase agreement. The previous board saddled us with debt, and now we are facing legal costs from their criminal defense and potential civil suits from members. We are looking at bankruptcy unless something changes." "So you want me to let you out of the agreement?" "No," Richard said. "We want to propose that you take over ownership of the Ridge View Cabins operation immediately. We would deed you the access roads and infrastructure we built, and in exchange, you would release the HOA from the purchase obligation and future lease payments. Essentially, you would own and operate the cabins outright." I thought about it. The cabins were on my property anyway. If the HOA went bankrupt, I would end up with them regardless, but it might take years of legal wrangling. This way, I could take control immediately and keep the business running. "I want complete operational control and ownership of all structures and improvements," I said. "No ongoing relationship with the HOA except for access rights to your roads for my guests. We can agree to that. We just want this situation resolved." We negotiated the details over the next month. Margaret structured an agreement where the HOA deeded me the access road that connected Ridge View Cabins to the main Whispering Pines entrance, along with an easement for utilities. In exchange, I released them from all future lease obligations and the purchase requirement. I also agreed not to pursue any claims against the HOA itself for the unauthorized construction, though I reserved the right to pursue claims against Patricia and David personally if their criminal cases resulted in convictions. The agreement was finalized on November 18th. As of that date, I owned outright a 22-cabin luxury vacation rental operation worth approximately $5 million in structures and improvements, all sitting on property I already owned. My total investment, maybe $20,000 in legal and surveying fees. Patricia Hendricks and David Craymore were indicted on November 30th on charges of felony embezzlement, fraud, and misappropriation of HOA funds. Their trial was scheduled for the following spring, but their attorney negotiated plea deals in late January. Patricia pleaded guilty to embezzlement and fraud, receiving a sentence of 3 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 18 months, plus restitution of $240,000. David pleaded guilty to similar charges and got 2 years plus restitution of $90,000. As for me, I spent December hiring a management company to run the Ridge View Cabins. I kept the name, since it had already gained recognition and good reviews from the summer guests. The cabins continued to perform well, and by the end of their first full year under my ownership, they had generated just over $1.8 million in gross revenue. After expenses, I netted about $600,000. I used some of that money to build a proper guest house on my own property, away from the rental cabins, so my friends and family could visit without being part of the commercial operation. I also invested in solar panels and a battery backup system, making my main cabin completely energy independent. The story spread through the local community and eventually made its way to regional news outlets. I did one interview with a property rights advocacy group, figuring it might help other landowners avoid similar situations. The key lessons were simple: know your boundaries, document everything, and never assume someone else has done their due diligence. I saw Patricia once after her sentencing in the parking lot of the county courthouse. She looked diminished, older than her years, wearing an orange jumpsuit and escorted by a deputy. Our eyes met for just a moment, and I saw anger there, but also something else. Maybe regret, maybe just the reality of consequences finally sinking in. Richard Powell and the new HOA board managed to stabilize Whispering Pines. They negotiated payment plans with creditors, settled lawsuits from members, and slowly rebuilt trust in the community. Richard told me later that the experience had taught the entire community a valuable lesson about oversight and accountability. They now had strict financial controls, independent audits, and term limits for board members. As for the Ridge View cabins, they became one of the most popular vacation rental destinations in the North Carolina mountains. Guests loved the combination of luxury amenities and genuine mountain atmosphere. I expanded the operation slightly, adding glamping tents on another part of my property for people who wanted a more rustic experience, and partnered with local businesses to offer guided hikes, fishing trips, and other activities. I never forgot how close I came to losing part of my family's land to someone else's negligence and arrogance. My grandfather had held onto that property through decades when he could have sold it for development. My father had preserved it when economic pressures might have pushed him to subdivide. And I had almost lost a significant piece of it because I was too busy with work to pay attention to what was happening on my own land. The experience changed how I approached property ownership. I had the entire parcel professionally surveyed again and installed permanent markers at every boundary point. I met with neighbors to confirm where our properties adjoined and made sure everyone had copies of the relevant surveys. I joined the local landowners association and started attending county planning meetings, staying informed about development proposals and zoning changes that might affect my property or my neighbors. On warm summer evenings, I would sometimes walk up to the ridge and look out over the valley. The Ridge View cabins, lit up in the gathering darkness, looked almost magical. Guests would be on their decks, cooking dinner on grills or just sitting and enjoying the view that had nearly been stolen from me by a combination of arrogance and incompetence. Patricia Hendricks had thought she could bully me, had assumed that because I lived alone in an old cabin and did not make a fuss about HOA matters, I would be easy to push around. She had gambled $4.7 million of other people's money on that assumption, built an entire development on land she did not own, and when confronted with the truth, had tried to manipulate and defraud her own community rather than admit the mistake. The irony was that if she had approached me honestly from the beginning, if she had discovered the survey error before construction and come to me with hat in hand, we probably could have worked something out. I might have sold them the Ridge property at a fair price or agreed to a reasonable long-term lease. I was not an unreasonable person, and I had no particular desire to run a vacation rental business. But she had chosen threats and manipulation instead of honesty. She had treated me like an obstacle rather than a neighbor. And in doing so, she had set in motion a chain of events that destroyed her freedom, her reputation, and the financial stability of the community she claimed to serve. Sometimes I wondered if she understood that, sitting in her prison cell. Did she see how differently things could have gone if she had just been honest and respectful? Or did she still think of herself as the victim, unfairly punished for a simple mistake? I supposed it did not matter. Justice had been served, not just in the criminal courts but in the fundamental restoration of property rights. My family's land remained intact, now improved with infrastructure and structures that I owned free and clear. The HOA members who had been defrauded by their own board had seen those responsible held accountable. And anyone else who might think about cutting corners on property surveys or bulldozing ahead with construction without proper verification had a cautionary tale to remember. As I stood on that ridge in the fading light, watching the last colors drain from the western sky, I felt grateful. Grateful for Thomas Morrison's meticulous surveying work, for Margaret Winters's fierce advocacy, for Richard Powell and the residents who demanded accountability, and for a legal system that, however imperfectly, had ultimately protected my rights as a property owner. The Ridge View cabins would continue operating for years to come, bringing visitors to experience the beauty of the Blue Ridge Mountains. And I would continue living in my grandfather's cabin, maintaining the family legacy while adapting to changing times. The property was secure now, properly documented and defended, ready to be passed on to the next generation when my time came. Patricia Hendricks had tried to take what was not hers, and in the end, she had lost everything. I had stood my ground, documented my case, and let her dig her own grave one heated cabin at a time. It was not the outcome anyone would have predicted when construction started that March morning, but it was the outcome that justice demanded. And every month, when I reviewed the financial reports from the cabin management company, I thought about how different things might have been. How a simple act of verification, of checking the actual property markers instead of assuming a fence line was a boundary, could have avoided all of this. But that was not the world we lived in. We lived in a world where people cut corners, where arrogance trumped diligence, where HOA boards thought they were above accountability. And sometimes, if you were patient enough and thorough enough, you could make them pay for every single one of those mistakes. I let them wire it all just like I had planned. Every cable, every pipe, every amenity and upgrade. And then, when they were fully invested and completely vulnerable, I pulled out the survey map and watched their world crumble. It was not mercy, but it was justice. And in the end, justice was all that really mattered.